Welcome to the Mini Book Podcast, African American Books Edition. Today, we are going into the monumental work, American Uprising, the untold story of America's largest slave revolt by Daniel Rasmussen. We thank you for listening, and please consider subscribing for future content. After hearing this, we would really encourage you to go out and purchase this book and support the author. We must also state that the voices you hear come from AI, but the content, it comes straight from the book, which we feel is a great way to learn about African American history.
It really is. And our mission today is to uncover, to really analyze a central yet, deliberately forgotten event in U.S. history. We're talking about the January 1811 uprising near New Orleans. And this was not just some localized riot.
No.
It was a planned, organized military march. It involved somewhere between 200 and maybe 500 enslaved men.
That number.
Yeah.
I mean, up to 500 armed, organized individuals. It's just absolutely staggering.
It is.
We're all taught about Nat Turner, we hear about John Brown, but the scale of this Louisiana revolt just completely dwarfs those others.
Yeah.
So why? Why is this event so profoundly absent from our collective memory?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's precisely the core challenge that this book addresses. The forces led by Nat Turner or John Brown were significantly smaller, yet they've become these historical touchstones.
Right.
The 1811 rebellion was different. It was different because of what it challenged. It struck directly at the heart of the emerging American plantation system in the Southwest. And even more critically, it was a direct political challenge to the expansion of American federal authority itself, which, had only recently acquired the Louisiana Territory.
So this is about more than just slavery on a local level.
Exactly. Our goal here is to redress that historical silence, the silence that allowed the sheer political sophistication and the massive scale of this struggle to just be swept away.
Okay, let's unpack this and set the scene for you, the listener. We really need to understand the location and the context of the massive wealth that fueled this entire situation. Where exactly was the German coast, and why was it so vital to the young American nation?
The location it's everything. This area, known as the German coast, sits just north and west of New Orleans. And you have to view New Orleans not just as a city, but as a continental gatekeeper. It's situated right at the mouth of the Mississippi River.
The American Nile.
Precisely. The sources emphasize that name, and for good reason.
And why that specific reference? Why the Nile?
It's because of the unbelievable volume of commerce that was passing through it. I mean, Thomas Jefferson himself captured its strategic importance perfectly. He labeled New Orleans the prime entrepot.
An entrepot being like a central hub, right? A port for trade.
Exactly. A central commercial hub through which, and this is Jefferson's quote, the produce of 3/8 of our territory must pass to market.
3/8 of the entire country's produce. Wow.
Think about it. All the grain, the furs, the timber, and then later, the coffee and sugar of the American Midwest. It all converged right there before being shipped out to the Atlantic world. So if you controlled New Orleans and the land immediately around it, you basically controlled the economic destiny of the entire American West.
So the German coast, being the prime agricultural land just upstream from New Orleans, it was literally the foundation of this entire economic engine.
Yeah.
But what made the agriculture there so uniquely valuable?
Well, it was incredibly fertile, yes. It's described as one of the wealthiest agricultural stretches in all of North America. But, this fertility came at a steep price.
How so?
We often picture this kind of romantic scenery, the green fields, the magnolias, these huge oaks draped in Spanish moss. But that landscape was intensely difficult to master. The Mississippi Delta is naturally swampy. It's prone to flooding constantly, so land clearance, large-scale drainage, and the continuous construction of levees to protect against the river, all of that demanded enormous capital, and most importantly, gargantuan amounts of highly coerced labor.
And the crop that made that high-risk, high-reward investment worthwhile was sugar. How lucrative was it, really? I mean, compared to, say, the tobacco or cotton fields back in the Upper South.
The returns were just phenomenal. Sugar planting in the Delta yielded returns that were higher than anywhere else in the U.S. The primary investments were land and slaves.
And they used that chilling legal term, chattel slavery.
Yes, meaning they treated human beings as movable property, like livestock or equipment. The Louisiana Gazette even noted the sharp contrast with the older slave states. It said that those cultivating sugarcane were, quote, making immense fortunes with the same number of hands which in Maryland and Virginia scarce suffice to pay their annual expenses.
So in other words, the Delta was basically a vacuum, sucking capital and wealth into the Deep South.
It was. It dramatically shifted the economic balance of power within the young United States, tilting everything toward the slave states.
It's against this backdrop, then, this booming, brutal, unprecedented wealth, that the revolt begins to take shape. Let's talk about this specific date. Epiphany Sunday, January 6th, 1811. For the planter elite, this was a moment of, what, profound self-congratulation.
Absolutely. January 6th marked the start of the carnival season, which would, of course, lead up to Mardi Gras. And the planters were euphoric. The 1810 sugar crop had just been harvested, and it yielded what they called unprecedented success. They felt invincible.
Can you elaborate on the kind of opulence they were indulging in? We need to understand the world they were so desperately trying to defend.
Well, take the example of Jean-Noël Destrehan. The sources describe him as the most active and intelligent sugar planter, a man whose lifestyle really epitomized that French colonial luxury.
I've seen pictures of his manor. It's still standing today.
Imagine it back then, hosting these elaborate five-course dinners. And these meals weren't just about the food, they were a performance of wealth. They were served by enslaved female attendants who were often described as beautiful, changing the tablecloths between each course with just copious amounts of Madeira and brandy flowing.
And this luxury wasn't just confined to the plantation manor. It extended into the city's social calendar.
That's right. That night, the elite would leave their plantations and head to the King's Ball in New Orleans. And the description of these events, it paints a picture of intense decadence. The sources use the term bacchanalian traditions.
What did that entail?
This meant dancing boleros, galopades, gambling enormous sums of money, and drinking until well after sunrise. Their entire lives were just consumed by these displays of material wealth and leisure, all of it built on top of unimaginable suffering.
It's really difficult to reconcile that level of, bacchanalian pleasure with the profound cruelty that was required to generate it. It sounds like they were in a state of deep denial about the human cost.
I'd say it was more than denial. It was a firm political and economic conviction. Destrehan himself articulated this rationalization. He stated that the German coast simply could not exist without the system. He argued that without chattel slavery, and I'm quoting here, cultivation must cease, the improvements of a century be destroyed, and the great river resume its empire over our ruined fields.
So that was the core belief. The wealth and the land were completely inseparable from the violence.
Completely.
And since we know the enslaved population heavily outnumbered the planters, what specific system of coercion was necessary to maintain control? What did the sources reveal about the physical realities of the slave system here?
The numbers alone explain the need for just perpetual violence. By 1810, the enslaved population on the German coast made up over 75% of the total. On some plantations, it was closer to 90%.
90%.
So control rested entirely on force, or the threat of force. The planters used sophisticated, deeply cruel tools of repression. Spiked iron collars, cowhide whips, and face masks were standard issue, basically, used to extract labor and encourage conformity.
So the book stresses that this heavy, continuous investment in violence was a massive political gamble.
It was. It created a world sitting on a powder keg, where the sheer volume of human suffering meant a backlash wasn't just possible, but inevitable.
So while the planters are celebrating their successful harvest and dancing the night away on Epiphany Sunday, the enslaved community is also gathering, but for a drastically different purpose. What was happening in New Orleans public spaces at this critical moment?
This is where we see the political world of the enslaved really taking shape. While the white elite celebrated carnival in their exclusive ballrooms, 500 to 600 African men and women were gathering in the common, the Place d'Armes,
Which later became Congo Square.
Exactly. And this space was a rare oasis of cultural and political expression.
Why was New Orleans unique in allowing these massive gatherings? In most of the American South, meetings that large were, strictly forbidden out of fear of conspiracy.
And that rarity is key. New Orleans had been governed by Spanish and French authorities for decades before the American takeover, and their slave codes, while still brutal, had different traditions than the Anglo-American South. They permitted these gatherings, a practice the Americans quickly restricted, which allowed for cultural continuity and exchange. The common area was vibrant, filled with cylindrical drums, African stringed instruments, and songs. More importantly, the participants bore ritual signs of their heritage: facial scars and filed teeth of the Congo, or tattoos of the Asante Kingdom.
So these gatherings were much more than just a dance in a market. They were a place for establishing collective identity, and critically, a space for political planning.
Precisely. The Spanish had long recognized the political danger in these assemblies. They feared them as a breeding ground for slave conspiracies and places where they plot their rebellions. It was here, in this unique, semi-autonomous space, that the network for the 1811 revolt was really solidified.
And emerging from this environment were two pivotal African-born leaders, Cook and Kwamana. What do their names and their origins tell us about the kind of military mindset they brought to this revolt?
Their heritage is incredibly significant. Cook is an anglicization of Kwaku, which means a male born on a Wednesday. In the Akan tradition, that's often associated with the spider trickster, Anansi.
Interesting.
And Kwamana is from Kwamina, meaning a male born on a Tuesday, sometimes associated with the ocean or the vastness of nature. They were almost certainly Akan people from the highly centralized and warlike Asante kingdom in what is modern-day Ghana.
So this wasn't just a cultural difference. We're talking about a military difference.
Absolutely. The Asante were professional soldiers. Cook and Kwamana were likely Okofokums, which translates roughly to common soldiers. It means they had received military training from birth. They arrived in Louisiana not as broken victims, but as men with deep strategic knowledge of organization, warfare, and leadership.
And yet they were also survivors of the most unimaginable trauma. The sources detail it with chilling clarity. Can you elaborate on the brutality of the slave trade that shaped them?
I mean, their very existence in 1811 was a testament to extraordinary resilience. The sources remind us that the system was built on industrial-scale death. 40% of those captured in Africa often died before they even boarded a slave ship.
40%.
Another 10% perished during the Middle Passage, that horrific journey across the Atlantic, or immediately upon arrival.
And the sources reference captains' logs from ships like the Diligent, detailing just constant warfare in the hold.
Yes. The struggle was continuous, both physical and psychological. And even for those who survived that journey, the labor in the Delta was so brutal that only about 30% of newly arrived slaves survived past the third or fourth year.
So Cook and Kwamana overcame this entire death cycle.
They did. And they were purchased soon after arrival and immediately began plotting.
So how did they use their cultural connections to build a revolutionary army, right under the noses of the planters?
They understood the value of stealth and coded communication. They were acquired at the New Orleans slave mart Cook for $700 and Kwamana for $600 by James Brown, a significant sum, and they wasted no time. They used the covert spaces available to them, discreet meetings in city cabarets, interactions during the frequent movement required for slave redistribution, and most crucially, the dances at the Place d'Armes.
Right.
They identified trustworthy individuals, often addressing them as countrymen, and it's likely the men solidified their commitment by swearing a war oath, invoking the primal powers of thunder and lightning to ensure secrecy and mutual commitment to death or freedom.
But the man who provided the essential local connection was Charles Deslonde, who actually held a position of trust within the plantation structure.
Charles Deslonde is, arguably the most complex figure in this story. He was a light-skinned driver on Manuel Andre's plantation.
Likely the son of a white planter.
Yes, which often afforded a measure of privilege. And the position of driver was highly contradictory. They were the slave elite, but they were responsible for enforcing the master's will, administering the whips, managing the brutal 16-hour workdays during harvest, and generally overseeing the violence of sugar production.
So they were often viewed with suspicion, even as traitors, by the field workers.
Exactly. Yet Deslondes used this position of internal authority and privilege to mask his revolutionary activity. He was living a double life.
A perfect double life.
By acting as the master's indispensable right-hand man, Deslonde had access to logistics, movements, resources. He was the perfect intermediary, connecting the African-born warriors like Cook and Kwamana, with all their military experience, to the local network of Creole and other African-descended slaves who knew the terrain.
And this network formalized its intent on January 6th. What were the final details of this Rebels Pact?
While the music and gambling continued in New Orleans, Deslonde, Cook, and Kwamana met in a small, windowless shack behind Manuel Andre's opulent mansion. They were joined by Harry Kenner, a skilled carpenter from the neighboring Kenner and Henderson estate, which just shows the breadth of their network among the privileged yet still enslaved labor force. They sealed their plan. They decided to strike on Thursday, January 8th. The risk was monumental, but their inspiration, that was even greater.
That inspiration being, of course, the successful Black Republic established just a few hundred miles away. We can't discuss the 1811 revolt without focusing on the seismic impact of the Haitian Revolution.
The Haitian Revolution, which saw the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue overthrow French rule between 1791 and 1804, it was the single most destabilizing yet inspiring political event in the Atlantic world. Haiti had been the economic powerhouse of the French Enlightenment, the wealthiest colony in the world, generating massive amounts of sugar and coffee.
But the slaves there, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, they beat back not only the local French forces, but also the armies of Spain and Napoleon himself.
An unimaginable victory. The success of a Black Republic was a political reality that slaveholders across the Americas desperately tried to suppress. The Louisiana rebels knew the stories and, crucially, they knew the revolutionary ideology. The vow sworn by the Haitian rebels echoed throughout the slave quarters. "We swear to destroy the whites and all that they possess. Let us die rather than fail to keep this vow."
So the 1811 revolt wasn't just some isolated act of desperation. It was an informed political movement aiming to replicate Louverture's success, to establish a free Black political community on American soil.
Exactly. It was a transfer of revolutionary technology and ideology. The knowledge that a slave army could defeat powerful European forces gave the 1811 rebels the ultimate justification for their freedom or death approach. This was not about running away, it was about overthrowing the entire system.
The revolutionary clock stops ticking on the night of January 8, 1811. The plan is in place. How did the initial strike unfold? And what was the rebels' goal beyond just escaping?
The initial action was immediate and it was violent. It was designed to signal the beginning of the end for the planter class. About 25 rebels, led by Deslandes, gathered in the slave quarters under the cover of a fierce rainstorm. They were fully aware that this act meant a near-certain death sentence, but they struck for total freedom.
And their first target, naturally, was Manuel André, Deslandes' own master.
They moved on André's mansion. André and his son Gilbert were asleep, presumably feeling secure in their wealth and power. The rebels stormed the house. They found Gilbert and wounded him severely with a cane knife, giving him 3 long, deep cuts. And they seized weapons, not just from the home, but they specifically targeted the public arms that was in one of Mr. André's stores.
So that was planned. They were acquiring resources.
A planned acquisition. They also took horses.
André escaped and rushed to raise the alarm, but by then the fire was already spreading. How rapidly did the rebel army swell in size?
Extremely fast. As news and rumors flashed through the slave quarters along the German coast, the uprising became a mass movement. The estimates place the eventual army size somewhere between 200 and 500 men. And this organized force began marching along River Road, which was the main artery leading directly toward their ultimate target, New Orleans.
What was the atmosphere of this march? Were they just running, or were they proclaiming a new order?
Oh, they were marching as a military force, proclaiming a new order. They were disciplined. They marched under their own rebel flags, and they were shouting revolutionary chants that echoed their Haitian inspiration. The sources confirm the cries, "On to New Orleans!" and the definitive declaration, "Freedom or death." This was a mobile political statement threatening to bring Saint-Domingue to the American mainland.
And we know there was immediate bloodshed. The planters' worst fears were realized almost instantly.
They were. While some loyal slaves, like a man named Dominique, managed to warn planters downstream, others chose, disastrously, to resist. François Trepanier is the prime example.
What happened to him?
He chose to stand and fight, maybe believing the walls of his high circular gallery house would protect him. He was mistaken. Cook's party immediately overwhelmed him, and he was, quote, cut to pieces.
That sent a clear message.
It confirmed for the terrified planter elite that the rebels were not interested in negotiation. Their goal was the destruction of the system and the creation of a Black polity.
Now let's turn to New Orleans. How quickly did Governor William C.C. Claiborne react, and what was the immediate security impact on the city?
The news hit New Orleans like a thunderbolt on January 9th. The panic was instantaneous and total. It was described universally as a miniature representation of the horrors of St. Domingo. Claiborne was acutely worried, and rightly so. The city itself contained a vast, potentially sympathetic African underclass. He realized the city was virtually defenseless against a disciplined march of 500 men.
So what specific lockdown measures did Claiborne impose to try and quarantine the city from this rising violence?
His response was swift, and it focused on halting the flow of information and preventing any internal conspiracy. First, he declared a citywide lockdown. He immediately secured the Bayou Bridge, the key artery connecting the German coast to New Orleans, to prevent any rebel forces from crossing or any communication between the two black populations. Second, he closed all the cabarets, the taverns, which he knew were frequent meeting places for the city's free and enslaved black population. And third, he imposed a strict 6 p.m. curfew on all male Negroes. It was an emergency measure designed to enforce total white control.
Claiborne also understood that this threat required more than just the local planter militia. This is where the federal government steps in, leading to what the book calls the Unholy Alliance.
It is the defining moment of the episode. Claiborne called for federal troops under General Wade Hampton, the commander of the Department of Orleans, to march out immediately. This joint effort between the planters' local militiamen who, held the French culture and often disdained American federal authority, and the U.S. Army was an unholy alliance between government power and slave-based agriculture.
Was this alliance truly unholy, though, or was it just the natural expression of American governance at the time?
That's a crucial distinction. From a moral standpoint, the alliance was abhorrent, merging state military might with the defense of chattel slavery. But politically, it was entirely predictable. The Louisiana Purchase, which brought these French planters under American rule, was implicitly a promise of protection for their primary asset, slaves.
So the federal government's rapid deployment just confirmed that promise.
It confirmed that, at its foundational level, the expansion of American power into the Southwest was synonymous with the expansion and protection of slave wealth.
So describe the final military confrontations. The rebels, facing a much better armed force, eventually retreated.
The combined force of federal troops and militia closed in very quickly. The rebel army, having marched some 15 miles, eventually pulled back toward an area called Can Brûlé. But it's fascinating to note their initial tactics. The sources indicate that they briefly confused the enemy by feigning a retreat.
A tactic?
Yes, a maneuver identified as a classic West African military ruse, common in the Congo, used to draw out and disorient a better-equipped force before turning to fight.
Which again speaks to the deep military sophistication of the African-born leaders.
It does. But the retreat couldn't save them against the overwhelming firepower of the organized military force.
Wow.
On January 10th, the slave army made its final stand. The battle was fought at close range. Reports suggest General Hampton's forces opened fire at about 300 feet, overwhelming the rebels, who were primarily armed with knives, axes, and a few seized guns. The result was devastating. 40 to 45 rebels were killed in the fighting.
And what was the fate of the leadership?
Charles Deslonde, the pivotal rebel chief, was captured either during or shortly after the battle. His execution was swift and brutal, meant as an immediate deterrent. He was reportedly taken to the home of a Major Milton, shot immediately, and in a horrifying display of vengeance, his hands were chopped off.
And the rest.
The remaining rebels scattered. They fled into the dense, almost impenetrable cypress swamps and canebrakes. The hunt then began, requiring the planters and militia to deploy both dogs and, notably, Native American trackers, capitalizing on the complex social politics that sometimes aligned indigenous groups with white authorities. Cook and Kwamana were eventually captured in the immediate aftermath as well.
The military suppression was then followed by an act of psychological warfare. This spectacular violence designed to solidify white authority. Tell us about the sheer terror that was unleashed in the aftermath.
The suppression immediately transitioned into a brutal campaign of terrorism. The planters committed what the book calls unspeakable acts of brutality. The key practice they employed was the ritualistic, terrifying practice of decapitation. And this was not random violence. The sources identify it as an Atlantic ritual, a deliberate tool used across various slave colonies, from Brazil to Jamaica, to suppress major revolts.
So it was a statement.
It was meant to make an ultimate, terrifying political and aesthetic statement that rebellion would result not just in death, but in degradation.
And the most enduring, horrifying image from this revolt is the installation of the heads on poles.
It was an act of deliberate, widespread, state-sanctioned terrorism. The heads of the captured and executed rebels were placed on poles along the entire stretch of River Road. This gruesome, silent warning spanned 40 miles from Destrehan, the epicenter of the revolt, all the way into New Orleans. It served as a horrific, great example intended to strike fear into the hearts of the remaining slave population and assert definitively the absolute power of American authority.
There's one witness description of this spectacle that is particularly chilling.
Yes. That image captures the sheer psychological horror. A witness described seeing a black, dried, sunken head on a pole, appearing to be, quote, smiling continuously at some endless and jocose dream of that eternal slumber.
It's designed to show perpetual punishment, denying even the dignity of death to the revolutionary.
Precisely.
And to lend some veneer of legality to these executions, the authorities held trials, which the book dismisses as a legal farce. What was the true purpose of the Destrehan trials?
The trials, held at the Destrehan Manor, the home of the very planter whose son was attacked, they weren't about justice. They were about justifying the massive scale of the repression and asserting the legality of the executions that followed. The outcome was, clear from the beginning. The planters were using the judicial process to extract confessions and, crucially, to obtain intelligence to root out any remaining parts of the network.
And despite the coercive nature of the interrogations, they inadvertently revealed the profound complexity of the conspiracy, didn't they?
They did. The interrogation testimonies, even those extracted under duress, some slaves, like a man named Amar, were too wounded to even offer a full testimony. They provided a window into the organization. The rebels were led by at least 11 separate leaders, hailing from incredibly diverse origins: Congo, Asante, and Creole, reflecting that mixture of cultures that was allowed to coalesce in New Orleans.
And their names?
Their names were a pan-Atlantic tapestry: French, German, Spanish, and various West African dialects.
This complexity, this Pan-African and Creole-led political movement, it must have challenged the planters' simple narrative. So how did the white authorities handle that inconvenient truth?
They systematically dismissed it. The planters and officials simply categorized the condemned universally as guilty of a list of crimes that stripped them of any political motivation: rebellion, assassination, arson, pillaging, etc., etc., etc.
Etc.
By boiling down a movement seeking political self-determination into etc., they reduced the struggle for freedom to common criminality.
And this criminalization was vital to Governor Claiborne's political project. He represented the new American federal authority, which needed legitimacy in a territory largely populated by, condescending French aristocrats. How did the revolt grant him that legitimacy?
Claiborne's main objective was to ensure the revolt was never seen as a political movement on the scale of Haiti, and he achieved this by repeatedly using legal language to endorse the planters' brutal response, conflating justice with safety and portraying the suppression as the triumph of American order.
He also emphasized the role of the federal troops.
He did, marginalizing the militia's role and intentionally writing the enslaved people out of the political discourse entirely.
So the terror essentially forced the French elite to accept and even appreciate American rule.
That is the ultimate political victory for Claiborne and for the United States. The French aristocrats, who had previously viewed the American governor with disdain and mocked his provincial customs, were now utterly terrified. They shed their condescension and came begging for federal protection, realizing the U.S. Army was the only thing standing between them and a Haitian-style revolution.
So this crisis solidified that unholy alliance.
It did. It solidified it between the local white elite and American federal power, allowing Claiborne to consolidate his authority and push for a more robust and more American state.
And the most significant, immediate political consequence was the acceleration of Louisiana's path to statehood.
The revolt provided the indispensable urgency needed to militarize Louisiana society and finalize its political incorporation into the Union. Statehood was achieved in 1812. The Terror of 1811 ensured that Louisiana entered the United States definitively defined as a slave country, committed to the expansion of slavery and the protection of slave-based agriculture. The rebellion, in its failure, ironically solidified the slave power's political position in the Union.
And once that political goal was achieved, the next step was to erase the memory of the revolutionaries from the historical record.
Claiborne wrote the first draft, focusing exclusively on the rise of American power and dismissing the rebels as irrelevant and trivial criminals. And this narrative of trivialization was embraced by subsequent generations of historians. Ex-Confederate historian Charles Gayar, and much later, the Yale historian Ulrich B. Phillips, they enshrined this interpretation, minimizing the political and military significance of 1811 by placing the uprising in a generic chapter on slave crime.
Which served the interests of white supremacy for generations.
For generations, masking the fact that the most significant act of armed resistance in U.S. history happened here.
But the memory persisted. It was transmitted through oral history, challenging this vast collective amnesia. We have to discuss the modern fight to reclaim this history.
The fight for memory is ongoing, and it's difficult. The sources highlight the work of an activist named Leon Waters, who grew up hearing the stories of the revolt from his great-aunt. Since the 1990s, Waters has waged a persistent battle against the silence. He compiled documents, often meeting with resistance and racist comments at local archives, and now he leads hidden history tours to challenge the cover-up.
Wow.
His work really underscores that historians must finally reckon with the politics of the enslaved and the profound humanity of these revolutionaries, who deserve recognition not as criminals, but as political actors willing to die for freedom.
Despite the crushing failure of the revolt and the violent suppression, the sheer scale of the 1811 uprising meant its memory couldn't be fully extinguished. How did the sacrifice of Deslandes, Cook, and Quamana continue to resonate within the slave community?
The story of 1811, though it was whispered and dangerous to tell, became legendary within the slave quarters for the next 50 years, right up to the Civil War. It served as a constant reminder that revolution armed struggle was always a possibility, and the fact that an estimated 100 to 400 of the original rebels simply vanished. Either into the swamps to live as maroons or just melting back into the plantation population, meant the memory of their courage was this hidden, persistent threat that kept planters perpetually nervous.
And we see the long shadow of this revolutionary spirit emerge during the Civil War itself, when Union forces finally captured New Orleans in 1862. This event was the external force that the 1811 rebels needed.
Absolutely. The Union victory provided the catalyst for the disintegration of the plantation economy. And what happened in 1862 was an echo of 1811, right down to the geography.
Oh, so.
Slaves on the German coast, recognizing their opportunity for self-liberation, marched out. In August 1862, armed with their agricultural tools, cane knives, scythe blades, clubs, they marched toward the city demanding freedom. They were retracing the path of the original revolt.
Wow.
It demonstrated the enduring aspiration for political autonomy in that exact location.
And this local resistance quickly translated into massive black military contributions that became essential for saving the Union.
It did. Black men immediately recognized that service in the Union Army was the most direct path to citizenship and political legitimacy. The first black regiments came from New Orleans, and by the end of the war, black soldiers constituted nearly 10% of the entire Union fighting force.
Which, as Abraham Lincoln admitted, was indispensable physical force.
It was. Lincoln's realization was blunt and powerful, acknowledging that the Union's survival depended on this black military might.
What was his quote?
His statement perfectly captured the leverage gained by the formerly enslaved. Keep it, and you can save the Union. Throw it away, and the Union goes with it.
And the irony there is incredible.
Think of it. 50 years after the heads of the 1811 revolutionaries were placed on poles to deny them any political existence, their descendants forced the U.S. government to recognize them as essential fighting men, securing their path toward emancipation and, eventually, civil rights. The violence of the revolt was redeemed by the violence of the war.
That legacy of necessary armed resistance for self-defense carries forward almost a century later into the Civil Rights era, which brings us to Robert F. Williams. This is a powerful, modern parallel to the political choice faced by the 1811 rebels.
Robert F. Williams, an NAACP leader and a military veteran in Monroe, North Carolina, provided the 20th century articulation of the necessity of armed self-defense. He lived in a time of extreme, constant violence perpetuated by the KKK and sanctioned by local white authorities during Jim Crow. His stance was simple. If the state, the federal government, would not protect black citizens from racist violence, then those citizens had the moral and constitutional right to defend themselves with arms.
His outspoken advocacy for militancy put him directly at odds with the mainstream nonviolent movement led by Martin Luther King Jr., and it caused an international incident.
It did. The key incident happened after a white jury acquitted a man who had attempted to rape a pregnant black woman in 1959. Williams's response was fiery. He declared that if the federal government would not halt lynching, then, if it's necessary to stop lynching with lynching, then we must be willing to resort to that method. He was directly attacking the fundamental hypocrisy of the American state, which promised equality but failed to deliver basic protection.
And just as the 1811 rebels were met with state suppression and elimination, Williams's militancy resulted in his own exile.
He was immediately branded a dangerous radical, persecuted by the FBI, and forced into exile in Cuba, where he lived for years. And while he was exiled, he continued his revolutionary political critique, attacking the hypocrisy of U.S. ideals globally. He even famously petitioned the United Nations asking for military aid.
What kind of aid?
Tanks, artillery, bombs, money, and the use of American airfields and white mercenaries to crush the racist tyrants who have betrayed the American Revolution and the Civil War.
The parallel is just crystal clear. From Deslandes in 1811 to Williams in the 1960s, Black Americans who chose the path of armed political action were universally met with state suppression, criminalization, or exile.
Absolutely. Their stories, spanning 2 centuries of American history, stand as enduring testaments to the strength of the ideals of freedom and equality, and the recognition that those ideals have often required armed struggle when the state fails to uphold them. The legacy of 1811 is the foundational political recognition that the battle for Black liberation in America was often a military one. And what we must emphasize, I think, in our final synthesis is that truly confronting American history means confronting the 1811 uprising, not as some side note on slave crime, but as a central political conflict that defined the nation's commitment to slavery. We have to address the stories of those willing to die for their beliefs. Their failure to achieve a Black republic in 1811 does not negate the sophistication of their politics, the complexity of their Pan-African and Creole world, or the profound humanity of the enslaved revolutionaries who saw violence as the only means to true freedom. We have a duty to acknowledge the history that was so violently silenced.
And that leads to a provocative final thought for you, the listener, as you reflect on this powerful history. Today, the Destrehan Plantation, which was the nerve center of the revolt and the site of the mock trials, is open for tours. These tours often focus heavily on the planter luxury, the architecture, and the details of the white elite's dining and dancing, the world of Jean-Noël Destrehan. Meanwhile, the path of the largest slave revolt in U.S. history is marked by a single, modest historical marker across the street from a fast food restaurant. What does this profound imbalance tell us about the national memory we choose to honor and the revolutionary history we still choose to silence? We encourage you to subscribe and share this podcast with others interested in learning about African American history. Also, please suggest in the comments books that you would like to hear in future episodes. Thank you for subscribing and listening.